Hi, good morning, and welcome back to the next session wherein we're going to be looking at covering Learning Outcome 6 on this particular unit, which is Health and Safety Management Principles and Policy. So what we are going to do is obviously cover the Learning Outcome 6 today, and this is having the 5 assessment criteria. There's a lot of content in this particular assessment criteria to cover, so we will try and see if we need to break this session down into session part 1 and obviously part 2, because there's lots to cover. So I'm going to start off with a bit of a quick introduction in terms of, what the Learning Outcome 6 covers, and then we'll go into the specific details of it to try and understand, the bits and pieces in terms of the assessment criteria. So the Learning Outcome 6 actually focuses on understanding the critical factors, related to the management of health and safety in a workplace. Now, what do we mean by critical factors? Critical factors typically tend to be factors like, which can actually lead to some sort of hazard or incidents, or in some cases, it can lead to incidents happening within the workplace. So when we look at, what are in general, when we say what are critical factors, I think one of the first things that we have to look at is generally look at the meaning of the word, which is, the elements which can essentially affect the success or implementation or development of anything in an organization. So when we look at goals, targets, there are that we end up taking as managers within the organization. They tend to be the let's say they tend to be the things that we need to achieve at the end of the day in terms of helping the organization achieve its objectives. So when we talk about critical factors, they are basically the essential elements that determine whether a project, whether a goal, objective, or something that the organization is going to try and do is going to be successful or not. And these critical success factors or critical factors, sometimes we also call them CSF, are the ones that we're going to be looking at, for the purposes of occupational health and safety within a workplace. Now, in general, if somebody was to ask me what are critical factors, they would be things like which help organizations and teams to achieve, certain goals and objectives. They could be used as benchmarks within the organization to try and better a particular, objective or achievement of that objective. And examples of these success factors can be things like for a service organization, it'll be customer satisfaction. For a retailing organization or an organization which basically sells goods to consumers through its retail outlets, it could be customer experience. For organizations which are involved in production, manufacturing, engineering, it could be innovation, continuous innovation that they're trying to bring out in terms of better efficiency, leverage in terms of productivity. They would be termed as critical, factors. So things like customer satisfaction, customer experience, depending on the industry that you work within. It could be innovation, it could be leadership in certain cases, it could be marketing of products and services for a marketing organization, and in some cases it could be related to environment and sustainability, because at the end of the day, if an organization like a hotel industry is, or if we look at the industry in general and we look at a particular hotel, their aim would be to try and look at conservation of resources, things like water, electricity, heat, the amount of waste which goes to the landfill. What they would be looking at is critical factors that would allow them, or implementation of technology, or usage of resources that will actually allow them to decrease their dependence on natural resources and obviously help in the conservation of these resources. So they will be termed as critical success factors, because steps that the organization takes to reduce that outlay in terms of waste, in terms of usage of electricity, energy, water, and leads to the conservation or better sustainability would be termed as or deemed as what are called critical factors. Now, this is what we need to discuss in this context today in this learning outcome, but this is to be discussed in the context of health and safety in a workplace. And there are 5 assessment criteria that we are looking at covering. So the first one talks about the key principles of occupational health and safety. The second one, some of these are going to be repetitive in another unit that we study, which is health and safety principles and policy. And that is where you would get to see that they would be repeated, and they will be useful for you to, revise or, discuss again because they would be covered in some part of the learning outcomes in that unit as well. So when we talk about principles, what are the principles? Principles tend to be, you know, principles, if I say, principles in general, when I talk about the, definition of principles, it could be something which is fundamentally, companies could adhere to, go by a book or set of rules, or, set of rules and regulations or policies which the, government in this case, or in some cases organizations in this case, would look at using for the purposes of carrying out day-to-day activities. So when we talk about, the occupational health and safety principles, we are talking about, keeping the people safe within a working environment in a workplace. We are looking at carrying out set of activities that we'll discuss, which will include things like risk assessment, adaptation. We look at, communication, which could be done through primarily via newsletters or other forms of discussion within the organization, and obviously things like training and providing information, which would, be useful for, because they would help keep the workers and the, the premises, safe within the organization, or with workers within the organization or within that premises safe. So the protection of any sort of, protection from, I would put it this way, from any sort of hazard or, substance within a particular organization would be helping us to understand the dealing that we have in terms of the principles of, health and safety. Now, we'll also be looking at adapting, obviously things related to policies, principles, and, obviously regulation, to ensure that we are able to mitigate risk and we are able to reduce risk within the organization. The second one talks about, features of vocational rehabilitation and what could be the kind of support services which, can be provided to employees, staff, contractors, if they end up having some sort of an injury, or assuming they have some sort of a disability. So in such cases, when we do talk about vocational rehabilitation, we'll go into the discussion of understanding the role of outside agencies in particular, when people, are looking at using this process to, or companies are looking at using this process to help individuals, employees, staffs, who have disabilities or illness or have suffered injuries and are now looking to returning to work. So this kind of support practically in most organizations is provided to people if they've had an injury or an incident and they are looking at now coming back to work after rehabilitation. What kind of support services or support can be put in place by the employer to help provide them to successfully get back into the organization or get back to work, would be essentially covered in this assessment criteria. Now, the third assessment criteria talks about, talking about the key aspects of management of occupational health, including legal considerations. Now, this is the area wherein we'll be looking at understanding what is the primary concern of occupational health and safety when we look at this being implemented within the organization. Here, we are looking at reducing errors, reducing incidents, reducing hazards, which could be caused by environment, working conditions, or physical infrastructure. And what we want to be able to do essentially is look at the aspect of, how these factors can be reduced, can be mitigated, and they would then help in the overall, let's say, maintenance of safety standards within the organization. Now, when we do talk about these components of, health and safety, and specifically relate them to, the aspects of management in terms of what is the role the management plays, then in such cases, what we are looking at primarily is the, the standards which people need to comply with, maintain, and ensure that they are following it, so that there is no person or no individual put into the harm's way. And if it does happen, then what could be the legal ramifications? Now we'll discuss a good example of this in terms of, air traffic management and control, which is going to give you a bit of a good example because there's a case study that I will share with you. And this talks about the legal ramifications of, if some of the aspects of these standards are not adhered to, then if it leads to accidents or injuries, then what would be the legal ramifications for the organization? And this is a case study that we will look at understanding, when we do understand key aspects of occupational health and safety within the air traffic control or management, and there the main aspect is to look at efficiency and performance. Then the next assessment criteria talks about, explain the causes, effects, and obviously the common types of mental health illnesses which can happen in a workplace. Now, there's a very good section on the health and safety executive website, which I'm going to provide a link to. And this particular section on the website directly relates to this particular aspect of, assessment criteria 6.4, because it helps us understand, what are the mental health conditions that can be generated from a workplace and how workers can be affected. So in the UK, there's a trend that 1 in 4 people will have a mental health problem at some point in time. Now, this could be common problems, which could be which could be because of the working that they do within an organization. And common mental health illnesses or problems in a workplace tend to be anxiety, depression, and in some cases they can be aggravated cases of stress, which can lead to other illnesses, and that is what we need to discuss when we talk about this particular criteria. Now, very briefly, this next criteria essentially talks about the causes and effect and identification of these work-related health and safety hazards, which are specifically that what we're going to discuss is related to violence and aggression. Now, when we do talk about violence and aggression within the workplace, again, there's a good article that I would suggest for additional reading, which is on the Health and Safety Executive website, which basically talks about how employers can protect workers from violence and aggression at work. And this particular article essentially tells us in detail about what could be the causes of violence at work, what could trigger aggression from one employee against the other. And when we do talk about violence and aggression, it can manifest in different forms, which could include things like verbal abuse, threats, including face to face, online, or even on telephone. And then aggression could also manifest itself in terms of physical attacks, which can happen within the premises when the workers or contractors, suppliers, employees, staff, even guests or visitors are in the location. So there might be violence that can come across from staff because of various factors of stress, aggression, or depression. And in such cases, a person getting into it can affect or harm members of public, customers, client, or other forms of customers within the premise. And this is what we need to look at in this particular assessment criteria, because what we want to be able to do is understand what causes and what are the effects of violence and aggression in the workplace. So we'll be looking at covering some of this particular assessment criteria. And what I would do is obviously try and break the session down into part one and part two, because what we want to do is address some of the indicative content which has been given. And this is more to do with hitting some of the assessment criteria which are, covered in this learning outcome. So let's look at, discussing this through, our presentation slides, which I've got for this particular learning outcome, and that would give us a very clear idea in terms of more detailing on what we need to discuss for this learning outcome. So, any questions at any given point in time, please feel free to ask either through the chat route, or you can ask me, by stopping me during the course of our discussion that we are doing. Now, with regards to this learning outcome, there are bits and pieces that I've given you a bit of an introduction on. But what I'm going to do when we go and discuss the slides, we are going to be looking at in detail, about some of the contents which have been asked to be referred within the unit specification, and that will give us a very good idea in terms of what we need to cover. So let's start off with a key terminology in terms of just to look at some of the key bits which are theoretical frameworks that we need to understand with regards to this learning outcome. Now, we talked about critical success factors or critical factors in the management of occupational health and safety. One of the key things that we also want to look at is um, the OHS responsibility, or occupational health and safety officer's responsibility within the organization, is in general to maintain well-being of its employees and people working within the organization. So how do we define well-being? Well-being is essentially nothing but a state in which an employee feels comfortable, healthy, and happy while working in a particular role within the organization. Or when you're within the office premises, you feel comfortable, you feel that you are away from harm's way, and obviously you feel content in terms of carrying out the responsibilities being assigned to you. And that is generally a state of well-being. That means I'm happy, I'm content, and I'm happy to tag along and complete this work because I'm not under any pressure or any sort of compulsion to be able to complete or do the work in a particular way. Now, we also need to understand what are occupational health hazards. So hazards tend to be, when we look at the general definition of the word hazard, this is something which we define as something which can cause, put you in danger, or can, activities or things that you can do which can be risky or considered as a risk. So when we do talk about danger, the two words which come to my mind and should come to your mind as well, that when we talk about the word hazard, it talks about danger or it talks about risk. Now, occupational health hazards are any sort of potential, areas of danger or risk which can actually pose, or cause some sort of incidents within the workplace. Now, when you're working within a location or a office premises, there can be different types of dangers and risks that you could face. There could be chemical risk, there could be biological risk, ergonomic risk, physical risk, psychosocial risks, occupational risks, which could be injuries, illnesses, which could happen because of the use of equipment or overuse or misuse of any sort of equipment which has been provided to carry out certain work. Now, it is very important to understand that how these can relate to you. So, if you work within a production manufacturing organization, you if you're dealing with, say, for example, if you're working within a pharmaceutical industry or a manufacturing industry unit, then you could have chemical and biological risk, because if there is spillage of any sort of chemicals or incidents which involve any sort of incident which can happen because of chemicals being used to manufacture medication, then it can pose some sort of chemical biological risk. When you do talk about ergonomic risk, ergonomic is basically, to do with the fact that when we do talk about usage of equipment, ergonomic is basically related to the working environment. So, in this case, if you're using a chair, if you're using a PC, or if you're using any sort of equipment, and proper protective care or proper gear to operate that equipment or training to operate that equipment has not been provided, then this can lead to some sort of strain, or over a point in time, some sort of injury, or cause some sort of, let's put it this way, uh, illness in you and in humans in general. So, for example, when you look at people who work within call centers, you generally see that they are normally wearing a headphone come mic. Now, if the sound decibels tend to be over the decibel limit of 51, it can start, creating or problems specifically in relation to hearing and hearing loss. So, most managers and IT equipments undergo some sort of test once a year, or depending on the usage, to ensure that they are meeting the required standards in terms of ensuring that employees, people using that, do not suffer from an illness, or it does not contribute to any sort of hearing loss because of the use of equipment. There could be a number of examples that you look at, in other areas. For example, if you work with PCs and you have, weak eyesight, then your employer could provide you some sort of anti-glare screen that can be put onto a monitor, or they could look at other things like regular breaks that you take every hour, after every hour of work, 5 minutes or 7 minute break, so that it doesn't put unnecessary strain on our eyes. These are all types of ergonomical adjustments or risks which can happen and can lead to potential injuries. You look at, if you're having a sitting job, typically a chair or an equipment that you use in the office could also be orthopedic, so that you're able to maintain a posture and it does not affect your back or does not give you backache or back pain. And these are all things related to ergonomics. We'll go into specifics of it, and psychosocial and other bits we will look at as we go along into some of the other slides. Now, one of the main types of risks that we talk about is biopsychological model risk. Now, this particular model was introduced by George Engel in 1977, and this basically suggests that the individual's health and safety is not solely determined by biological factors. It is also significantly influenced by psychological and social aspects, which also play a very important role in how the person's mental health and overall well being is determined while working within an organization or within a particular workplace. So when we do talk about mental health, we talk about well-being, we talk about health and safety. There are various aspects or factors to it which can affect the health and safety of an individual and the overall well-being of the individual within the place of work. And that is what is discussed in this biopsycho social model, which was proposed by George Engel. Now, this is something that you need to know theoretically, because of the fact that this model is now widely accepted. It has three aspects to it. So it looks at the overall well-being of an individual working within an organization or a workplace. When we talk about health and safety or occupational health and safety, it has three aspects: biological, social, and psychological. And within that, he came up with the various factors which can affect the overall well-being of an individual working within that premise, workplace, or an organization. And this is something which is used for the purposes of evaluation when we do see people, having injuries or having developed illnesses or injuries, which could be because of the work environment. And in such cases, this model comes in handy because it helps us determine very clearly the three factors and then segregate those three factors, why this injury would have occurred, or what are the long-term effects of this particular hazard. So, or if it leads to the injury in that case, then what could be, how do we segregate them, and then obviously look at what kind of an effect is it having on biologically, which is the body, physically, which is in terms of, again, any sort of physical manifestations that you're able to see, and how would this affect the individual when the individual is within a social environment. So these are some of the key concepts that we need to understand specifically for this particular learning outcome, which are critical success factors or critical factors related to occupational health and safety. So any questions on this so far, feel free to ask. Now, we'll go into some of the assessment criteria of this learning outcome. So the first one talks about the key principles of occupational health. Now, there are 6 principles of occupational health and safety, which we all need to be aware of. Pretty simple. These are, literally to be understood. So these principles are protecting and promoting workers' health. You're looking at improving working capacity. You're looking at preventive approach within the organization. That means there are policies and procedures in place which help in risk mitigation. We use the risk mitigation metrics here, and the idea there is to, we have that saying, prevention is better than cure. So we basically look at regular audits, inspections, to be carried out to ensure that these kind of incidents do not happen within the organization, or any sort of incident does not happen within the organization. And that is where the preventative approach comes in. Provision of health and safety in health services needs to be done, so that if incidents do happen, specifically in production engineering, or organizations which are involved in physical work with equipments, there are incidents and accidents which typically happen. In such cases, the organization needs to have what is called rehabilitation, and obviously a provision wherein they are able to look at revisiting the process, obviously look at a structure which allows the minimization of these incidents to happen in the future. And that is where the risk mitigation and regular audits and inspection, which typically tend to happen, wherein we know that there is a higher propensity of accidents to happen, or hazards which we are aware of. And what we do is we basically use the risk model to basically try and see how do we look at the classification of these risks in terms of numbering or some sort of ordering to say, okay, this particular model will help us understand that this is a risk which is going to pose a significant threat. This is a risk which is not going to pose a significant threat, and this is a risk. Although this is a risk, but it might not have any immediate or some sort of outcome as far as the say, for example, carrying out that work is concerned. So when we do look at using the risk assessment matrix, what we look at is we look at defining risks in terms of likelihood and severity. And in some cases, sometimes you do have these risks which are unlikely, or their severity is going to be negligible. So we classify them as low. And that is where the provision of these health and occupational health services comes into play, because that is clearly used several times across the audit and inspections in the year. And it's a key part of risk assessment, risk management, and is often used in the workplace because it helps protect people and helps the organization comply with rules and regulations in that particular geography or country. The last is compensation and rehabilitation. If accidents do occur, then the organizations need to have a policy in place which allows them to look at relevant compensation and rehabilitation. That means if there is some sort of physical injury which has happened, which could disable the worker from working for a couple of weeks, then the organization should be able to allow, as using its policies and procedures, the worker to recuperate, undergo physiotherapy or some sort of medical attention. And once the employee recovers, there are steps taken in place to be able to reintegrate and get the employee back to work, and that would be covered under what is called compensation and rehabilitation. Now, these principles typically require three different things to happen within the organization. There is a compulsorily focus required in education and training. There are shared responsibilities between workers, employers, employees, and authorities, because authorities would have maybe the guidelines and they would basically stipulate the regulations which are required to be followed within the organization. The employee and the employers and obviously workers, if there are third party workers which work within the organization, they have the responsibility to be able to adhere and understand these requirements, and then meet these requirements by playing their role in terms of ensuring that the premises are safe and secure for the purposes of working for other individuals. And the organization commits itself to continuous improvement. Health and safety, as we know, is one such area which requires continuous monitoring and continuous improvement. The reason I say this is because there are standards which change, there are regulations and conditions which change, there are changes to the working environment within the business and where the organization operates. And in such cases, when these things do change, what is required to be done is to ensure that the compliances, the policies, the procedures also stay updated. And in such cases, continuous improvement needs to be done as far as the implementation and following up of the principles of occupational health are essentially concerned. So when we do talk about in a nutshell, what we are saying is that these principles help in protecting the workers or the employers working within an organization within a particular premise. They help in preventing hazards. They provide and budget for comprehensive health services, and in some cases, if incidents do happen, then rehabilitation and compensation are a part and parcel of this policy, which allow organizations to offer, I would say, rehabilitation and compensation to its employees because of incidents or accidents which have taken place in the premise. So that covers first assessment criteria. We move on to the next one, which is 6.2. It talks about outlining the features of vocational rehabilitation, including the role of outside support services. So here, the key aspect is we need to outline. We don't need to go into detail, but if you want to go into detail, then the idea would be to look at reading some of the links which are provided on the Health and Safety Executive website, which would talk about in detail about what is rehabilitation and how does government advocate advice and guidance for employers to be able to have this part, integrated into the health and safety procedures within the organization, in large organizations in particular. Now, when we talk about vocational rehabilitation, that's the key word that we need to understand. What is vocational rehabilitation? So, if I were to define vocational rehabilitation, and if I essentially look at, the meaning of the word vocational, how I don't know how many of you understand the meaning of the word vocational, but when we do talk about vocational, we mean it's related to occupation, related to your employment. That is why the word vocational. So vocational is related to employment or occupation, and here in this case, what we are talking about is particular standards that will apply in relation to your occupation and the skills that you need to have to be able to work effectively within your particular role. Now, when we talk about vocational rehabilitation, which is, if I use the word vocational, that means rehabilitation in relation to occupation or employment. So when we talk about this, it is a process which is designed to essentially help individuals with disabilities, illnesses, or injuries return to work and maintain their current employment by providing personalized assessments, provide interventions, and also support services. So, for example, if there was a worker working within an engineering factory, and the worker actually works with certain equipment, and if he uses that equipment on a daily basis, and in some case, if there is a bit of a lapse of concentration in that particular function, or the usage of that equipment causes an injury, then the employer, because the injury has happened within the organization on the site, it is the employer's responsibility to ensure that the worker receives treatment. The worker is receiving, if it is a life-threatening injury, sometimes we say that there's an amputation of arm or a leg or a finger or any sort of thing which is life-threatening is required, then in such cases the organization should have a policy which discusses and has a clear provision for providing compensation because that injury has happened at the place of work during the time of work, and that could be because of the equipment not being faulty, or the lapse in concentration, or processes or proper processes not being followed. But at the end of the day, the injury has happened, and in such cases, rehabilitation will include compensation and remuneration also to the employee. So when we do talk, if and in this case, just as an example, I know will not go into detail, but if I just talk, if the person has had an injury, then the person needs to also recover from that injury, and at some point in time needs to then get back to work, which the person is, originally intended to do. So in such cases, when injuries happen and people require help and assistance to be able to get return to work, that means the person might require medical attention, might require physiotherapy, might require training or retraining in this case, and then once they've gone through this particular procedure, at some stage the occupational health and safety officer would do the personalized assessment of the individual, that the individual is fit to return to work and fit to take up that function. Then in such cases they would be allowed to go back to work. Now all this process, which is managed from the time a person gets injured or develops an injury to the time that it is able to return to work, is all covered under what is called vocational rehabilitation. Now, there is a role which the outside agencies also play, and these outside agencies, what are these outside agencies? So let's name some of these agencies. Now, if a worker has had an injury at work, one of the outside agency would be that, as a requirement from the employer side, and from the health and safety executive, it's a major incident which has happened within the organization. The organization is required to report this to the HSC, or the health and safety executive. So that would become an external agency. Now, if the person needs medical attention, ambulance and emergency services are required and they are called, and the person needs treatment, then in this case, the healthcare provider becomes an external agency. Now, if the person raises a claim that it was not my fault, it's the employer's fault, and the person has sustained, say, for example, life-threatening injuries, and that has led to some sort of disability, then the employee can actually, go to the employment tribunal, and in such cases, they would essentially file a claim against the employer, and that would involve what is called employment services. So these tend to be external agencies. maybe the health and safety executive, the NHS, or in this case, the healthcare provider or hospital, or the A&E services, which are called to attend to that particular injury or accident or incident. And last but not the least, if it leads to compensation, dispute, or any sort of dispute which is referred to the employment services or tribunal, then they would become the third party or outside support parties or agencies which would be involved in this process of vocational rehabilitation. Now, what we need to be able to understand in this assessment criteria is that what are the key things which are included under vocational rehabilitation. So this includes things like comprehensive assessment of the premises. It includes things like goal setting. It includes things like career counseling, job redevelopment, workplace modifications if there are chances that the employers can have injury at the workplace while working in certain roles and responsibilities which is given, and then the ongoing support to ensure that the employees are able to manage their health conditions and overcome these barriers or injuries or hazards which they face while at the place of work, to be able to do their work or discharge their duties effectively. Now, some of the key features that we need to look at in terms of vocational rehabilitation, they tend to be things like when people are looking at if they have injury and they're looking at going back to work, personalized assessments need to be done to ensure that they are fit for purpose. Now, one of the things that you would know is that some employees sometimes require a fitness note, and that fitness note comes in from your GP or from your surgery. So if you've had during COVID, for example, some of the employers mandated that if you're returning to work after being diagnosed with COVID, you are required to produce a fitness note. In some cases, if you're doing physical activity or you carry out physical function activity and functions within the organization, people who work within road works and other type of jobs or job related requirements. In some cases, if you're not well and you are taken unwell and then you want to get back to work, sometimes your employer might require you to bring across what is called a fitness note. Now, in such cases, the employer can also mandate individualized assessments. That means a thorough evaluation of individuals' physical, cognitive, and psychological abilities to see if you're fit to work in that particular role after you've suffered an injury or you've had, say, a severe or a prolonged illness. So, in such cases, the idea is to do away with any sort of limitations which could pose further risk to that individual working in that role or responsibility. And in such cases, to identify such risk factors, individualized assessments need to be carried out to ensure that the individual is able to meet those specific needs and there are no barriers for him or her to come back and start working in that role after they have had the illness or the injury. Excuse me. So when you look at the features of vocational rehabilitation, there are lots of different areas that we can look at. Things like, are the goals set for the individual quite aggressive by the organization? Does it lead to any sort of, stress or anxiety because the goals or the targets being set are quite high and they're unachievable, demotivation which can kick in, and obviously that leads to stress and depression. So those are areas that you would need to look at from a point of view of the area of your work. Now, these factors or these features can vary depending on the organization or the industry in which you work. I've listed down a few on the slide which primarily are generic. Things like counseling and guidance, training which could happen both on site and also training which could involve trials of people working in work. Sometimes you would see that during the construction industry, if there's a company which takes on a couple of masons or plasterers or joiners, then what they normally do is also do sometimes work trials. If you look at the armed forces or some of the technical jobs which people end up taking up, employees in some cases, like if you look at companies like Facebook, LinkedIn, and some of the other organizations like Meta, they would normally have people, if they're taking on people on programming positions, they would normally have a work trial. They would normally ask them to come in and do a trial in terms of understanding whether they have the competence to be able to carry out that work. Now, there are things which organization also does, because you cannot come with all the skills. Sometimes organizations look at reskilling, development, or upskilling for employees, and in such cases, it is done primarily to ensure that you are keeping up to date with the key requirements which are required for you to deliver or work within that role. One such good example would be the health and safety training, which most employees go through within their organization. People who are designated as first aiders or fire marshals undergo some sort of mandatory training to refresh and keep themselves up to date with regards to the skills that they have. If a need should arise, then that would be, something that they will be using. And in such cases, you would generally see a lot of skills development, which is through training programs, is done within the organization. Now, there could be other aspects. So, what is the other aspect that we want to look at? Role of outside agencies, support agencies. Now, we talked about three in general. Say, for example, employment services, healthcare providers. You look at government support, or in some cases, you also look at, outside agencies being, contractors or I would say, um, you know, hospitals and other bits if they need to come in and attend to any sort of injury which has happened. Now, the role of outside agencies is also what we need to understand in this context. So, what is their role? What it is that they come in and actually do? Now, outside agencies might, if I look at employment tribunal, they might essentially look at setting, what are called standards or regulations which all employees need to follow. If I look at the health and safety executive, they set the standards in terms of what could be the health and safety requirements which organizations need to follow in terms of policies and procedures to keep employees safe within the organization. There could be government agencies which do just education and provide information. Their main role would be to look at ensuring that they provide and keep the members of public updated with the information related to the health and safety standards within the organization and in any industry in general. So, for example, there might be different standards for construction agents industry or construction sector. There might be different standards for engineering, pharmaceutical, or services organization. The government could be an outside agency because in some cases they might provide support and financial assistance in order to ensure that various compliances, laws, and legislations are met. So one of the things that you look at is in terms of sometimes government looks at funding and providing financial assistance when disasters happen, or for example, large scale disasters happen within a particular country or geography, then government would look at financial aid and funding. So during COVID, for example, the government provided financial assistance to a lot of businesses because there were lockdowns introduced in order to stop the spread of the virus and the infection. And in such cases, financial assistance was provided, by the government, and that was primarily to keep individuals, members of the public, safe and prevent COVID from spreading. And in such cases, this is an example of an outside agency providing, funding and financial support, to organizations and employees. There were things like the, employment pay schemes. There were things like, funding or, rent infrastructure. I would say reimbursements provided to businesses, small, medium businesses, and that was in under the pretext of financial assistance given to agency, I would say organizations and employees working within the organization. Now, any questions, please feel free to ask. Now we go into the third assessment criteria. So the third one talks about articulating the key aspects of management in terms of legal considerations. So now here we know that we have looked at bits and pieces related to the support which is required in terms of rehabilitation and the role of outside agencies. Now, in this particular assessment criteria, we are going to be looking at specifically covering what are called legal considerations and what are the frameworks which are required, to be followed to ensure that if, I would say any sort of incident or any sort of health and safety hazard does occur within the organization and its premises, then what is it that the government tends to do in terms of legal considerations with the aspect of maintaining health and safety. Now, the key aspects of looking at identifying any sort of hazard which could prevent normal functioning to happen within the organization, whether the organization carries out thorough risk assessments in a particular location, whether do they have procedures which are going to be preventive procedures to control, say, spread of any sort of infection within the office or the premises where the employees work. It could be providing training to employees to ensure that they are abreast and they're up to date with the safety procedures being followed within the organization, maintaining records, of incidents which have happened in the organization using the incident logbook, looking at actively monitoring, health concerns. One of the things that you could look at is sometimes if there are certain types of illnesses which happen within the organization can spread from the use of various services, like for example hygiene related services. If you're using the toilet and if somebody has diarrhea or any sort of other infection, and it can spread, it can cause it can spread through the use of public toilet or facilities. And in such cases, you would, as an organization, need to actively monitor health concerns by consulting employees on safety matters to say that, okay, if you have this particular condition, you should take a day off, or in order to prevent any infection to spread within the office and office premises because of the use of public toilet and facilities. Then, in such cases, health and safety matters and complying with such health and safety matters could be covered under what is called active monitoring, by the employer, and they would be health concerns in terms of hay fever, for example, or any sort of flu in some cases. And that is where the organization asks the employees to take a day off or work from home in some cases in order to prevent or mitigate the risk of spreading the infection within the office to other employees, or within the premises to the other employees working within the premises. And that is done primarily to look at um, minimizing risks to the health concerns or risks to the health of other individuals working within those premises. So when we do talk about legal considerations, what we do mean by when we do talk about legal considerations, that's the key word here. So when we say legal considerations in the case of occupational health and safety, that is what we need to be able to understand and have a good understanding from a point of view of working as a health and safety or an occupational health and safety officer within the organization if you work within that role. Now, when we do talk about these legal considerations, what are the legal considerations? They are basically health and safety of the employer and the employee. You, as an employer, you have a legal duty to assess workplace risks. You have the legal duty to provide a safe working environment. You also have, as an employer, a legal duty to ensure proper training and equipment is available for usage within the premises and the organization. As an employer, you're required to consult with employees regarding any sort of safety concerns which arise because of operations or operating environment within the office or the premises. And as an employer, you are legally bound to implement measures which can control and identify potential hazards which have the ability to cause harm to employees, employers, or even people visiting the premises, and they would all be considered or fall under what is called legal considerations. So anything within the HASWA Act, which is basically the Health and Safety Act, Health and Safety at Work Act of 1974, is going to be looking at dealing with what is called legal considerations. So in the UK, essentially, this is the act which is related to, if I put it this way here, HASWA, HASWA Act, 1974, and this was updated, in the 2010 by the government, and this includes providing adequate welfare facilities, safe access, reporting any serious incidents to relevant authorities, and they are all a part and parcel of what are required to be followed by employers as legal considerations. Now, there are certain aspects of occupational health and safety law that we need to understand under legal and regulatory work. So they would include things like risk assessment, a safe working environment, looking at providing training to employees, making sure that personal and protective equipment is available, and in some cases also look at consultation with employees to or their representative to ensure that the health and safety matters or concerns regarding health and safety are adequately addressed, by the employer. Now, if there are incidents which happen even after following all these procedures, there are injuries which can occur, there are near misses which can happen, then they need to be all reported to relevant authorities. And in such cases, legal considerations comes into play, because that is a legal requirement from the Health and Safety Executive to, or under the Health and Safety Act of 1974 and 2010, to be able to report serious accidents, injuries, and near misses to relevant authorities. So in the UK, it is the HSC, or the Health and Safety Executive, and specific regulations related to Health and Safety at Work Act include, looking at providing following the workplace regulations, which is covering basic health safety requirements, such as maintaining the building in a good state of working, providing adequate space for movement, and managing floor surfaces, and that is a part and parcel of the workplace regulations. The other part of the Health and Safety Act is the management of health and safety at work regulations, which means it requires employers to implement a structured system for managing health and safety risks within a particular premise. And last but not the least, which is called RIDDOR, RIDDOR, and this is reporting of injuries, disease, and dangerous occurrences regulation. And this specifically talks about any workplace incidents that occur should be reported to the authorities. And these are things which are covered under what are called legal, considerations. So when we talk about these specifics in general, I would say that these are the specifics that need to be, covered under what are called the HSC Act of 19, say, I would say 1974, and are basically considered as what are called legal considerations. So these are bits that we need to be aware of as a health and safety officer working, or as a person working within this particular role within an organization in the context of UK. And if we do, look at further aspects of it, this is the employer. And then there are bits and pieces related to employee responsibilities, and that would be these, that as an employee working within the organization, it will be considered that you're not following the legal requirements, is to say that you're not following the safety procedures and reporting hazards to the employer. You're not wearing personal and protective equipment wherever it's required for you to use it in your place of work, and you're not cooperating with the health and safety measures which are set by the employers in order to ensure the overall health and safety of the individual working within the organization. So these bits typically look at talking about the essentially the management of occupational health and safety, but in the context of legal considerations. What are the legal requirements? And that is what is essentially covered. Now, there could be other aspects of it, things like mental health and general well-being of the employees, and they would also be a part and parcel of the legal considerations, because if the employer does not have an updated health and safety policy, then this could be non-compliance with the requirements on the legal side. Because if you, for example, you have transitioned from a services business to a manufacturing business, and you've not made changes to your health and safety policy in terms of including rehabilitation and compensation as a component, because of the fact that now your employees use physical or some sort of equipment to be able to carry out work, although risk procedures are followed, but and risk procedures ensure that there are no accidents or injuries happening. But as a part of the legal compliance, your health and safety policy also needs to be amended. And because you've transitioned from a service organization to a manufacturing organization, you need to have the rehabilitation and the compensation component also as a part of your health and safety policy. Now, if that is not there, if it is not followed, then there are legal considerations. That means you can be taken to the court of law, you could be fined, and those are what examples of what you need to give as far as this particular assessment criteria is concerned. Now we come across to the next criteria, which talks about the explaining the causes and effect, of identification of control of common type of mental health illnesses that we see, which can happen within the organization. So here is where what I would suggest is that there is a very good article that I would want to show, which talks about the mental common mental health conditions which can arise because of the employee working within the organization or any particular premise, and that is what I would suggest that you need to go through in terms of this particular article. It talks about mental health conditions which employees could have at work, and or because of can develop because of working continuous working within a particular premise or a workplace. Now, this guidance relates to talking about work related stress, but stress can be prolonged to both physical and mental health and cause mental ill health because it includes anxiety and depression. So, how do you look at managing work related stress, and how do you manage it, and what kind of effect it has? Because it talks about discussing causes and effect and identification of common types of mental ill health in the workplace. So, this particular two-page article with some hyperlinks giving you examples of how and why this came about is relevant to this particular assessment criteria, and I would suggest that it is something that you need to look at reading or as an additional reading to be able to cover this assessment criteria. Now, going back to what I want to discuss on this particular with the use of slides. Now, what are the common, because it talks about causes, effects, identification, and control. That is what we will discuss in this criteria. So, what are the causes of mental ill health? So, when we do talk about ill health, what are the various causes of ill health which can happen? Now, we generally see that ill health can be caused or mental ill health can be caused at your workplace because of various things. Things like excessive workload, it could be unrealistic deadlines or expectations by your manager or your employer. It could be lack of control over your work because you have too much to do in terms of your plate is excessively full, and that means that you move from one task to the other, and that is overloading of work by your employer. It could also mean, from a broader perspective, a poor job design or ambiguity in your role. Now, if there is overlapping of job functions within you and your colleagues within the organization, this can also cause work related stress because you do not have ownership of that particular piece of work, and you feel that my work is divided amongst two or three other people, and the credit that is due to you may not come to you because there are other people working on that particular job or job role as well. So in such cases, it is because of poor job design and no clear demarcation of responsibility, and that can also cause work-related stress. And then one of the things that we do get to see within today's organizations is constant change and uncertainty, and that can also cause work-related stress. Now, we can also look at mental ill health, which can be caused primarily because of the fact that there could be some organizational factors which are affecting, individuals or different types of individuals working within the organization. So they could be things like poor communication with your manager or management. It could be lack of support from your management. Say, for example, you face certain problems at your place of work, and these problems, in order for them to be addressed, require maybe additional budget or resources, but even after successive requests to your manager or senior management, budgets are not provided, and that means compromised output is done, and you are blamed for it. Then, in such cases, lack of support from management could also be one of the factors which can cause mental ill health. Now, it could be unrealistic performance expectation, maybe stretch targets given specifically to sales team and marketing team. And sometimes you see in organizations they've been given excessive targets which they feel they cannot achieve, or it's overstretching them, and that can also cause mental health, which is anxiety and depression. That means I'm not able to achieve, and I'm not able to achieve the bonus or get the bonus, and I always get scolded or reprimanded by my manager because I've not been able to meet the targets. Could be one such example. Bullying and harassment can also be taken as an organizational factor which can cause ill health within the organization, because if you see your manager as a bully, or you're continuously harassed for a certain type of things, for example, your background, your culture that you come from, or certain disability, then this can be seen as harassment, which can also lead to mental health issues. Now, there could be individual factors. So, what I suggest that if I have to classify them, you know, I would normally classify them into three different types. And these three different types could be, organizational factors. These could be, for example, personal factors, and these could also be classified as what are called, work-related factors, which is related to your work directly. So when we do talk about these, essentially, I think we can group them into three different categories, and these three different categories would essentially help you identify, what are these work related stress factors, or organizational factors, which can essentially cause mental health, or stress, essentially, when you're working within the organization. So I'm just going to put them here for the purposes of ease of discussion, and they would be, factors which can cause mental health issues, or cause issues related to mental health when you work within the organization. So these could be the causes of, workplace causes of mental health issues, something that you need to be aware of. Now, I what are the effects? So these now are causes that we know can cause, these are causes which can cause mental health issues. Now, what are the effects? That is what we also want to understand, because it talks about cause and effect. Now, again, I will put in a slide here which will talk about, the effects. So, effects of mental health, if you're facing, for example, stress, anxiety, depression, bullying, or harassment, or ambiguity in your role, what is the effect of that on your mental health? So the effect of that on your mental health are going to be things like reduced productivity. You would probably look at taking off time off from work. You'd probably look at your morale going down. It might lead to you not being able to effectively work. Your attention at work, might be deprived, and in such cases, it can lead to further incidents or accidents. And these are going to be effects that you generally get to see because you're suffering with mental health or some sort of stress related issues while at your work within the organization. Now, what the other part of it talks about, how do we look at, control. So the third slide that I'm going to put together here is to understand how do we control these issues happening within the workplace. Now, this is an important part because of the fact that when we do talk about, we know what causes it, we know what effect will it have, and then what we also need to know is how do we control, these issues occurring within the organization. Now, one of the things that we can do is we can promote positive workplace culture. That means your employer essentially looks at encouraging open communication, with the employee. It talks about respecting and supporting the employee, and that is to look at promoting a positive workplace culture. Now, the employer can also look at work-life balance. So the employer is actively looking at providing, support for you to be able to work flexible hours. There is a proper, process in place to ensure that you get some holidays across the year. You are able to, there are policies which the employer puts in place to discourage, excessive overtime or excessive work that you would want to do. And they would be, to promote a better personal, professional work life balance, by the employer for the employee. Then you could have, for example, stress or training. I would put the word training. Now, this could be stress related training because you work in a particular industry or in a job role wherein stress is one of the outcomes of what you end up taking as your role and responsibility within the organization grows. You have more people to manage or more responsibilities to manage, and in such cases, stress management as a training, how to manage stress or how to look at coping with stress could be a training which the employers could organize and ensure that it is compulsorily to be attended by all employees. The employer could also look at, job design improvements. That means they could look at improving your job description. If the role becomes too big, can be broken down into different roles. They might give you additional support by looking at providing additional manpower to work with you or work alongside you, and that would be to look at ensuring that your job has very clear responsibilities, clear expectations, you have appropriate workload, and it also looks at giving you autonomy to be able to make decisions in that role. And then amendments to workplace policies, you know, keeping in line with changing times, organization also looking at making changes to the policies, things like, harassment and bullying, discrimination came in, in the early 2000s, and there are various acts within the UK which basically look at ensuring that there are laws and regulation against this, so that no person can be bullied or harassed or discriminated against in the place of work, and your employer actively implements these policies to ensure that nobody is harassed or bullied in a place of work when you're carrying out responsibilities given by the organization. So some of these could be treated as, taken as, I would say, measures that will help you or the organization control, you know, mental health issues occurring or reduce the mental health issues occurring within the organization. So this helps us cover the assessment criteria because it talks about cause, effect, identification, and then the control of how these can be done within a workplace. So this gives you an idea in terms of what could be the workplace related mental health issues, which are work related organizational factors or individual factors, and how they can be identified and how they can be controlled by the employer within the organization. So any questions on this, just feel free to ask. Now, the last one that we want to look at is, related to looking at explaining the causes effect, but in this case related to violence and aggression. So in the first one, we looked at the previous criteria. We looked at essentially what is called mental health issues. Here we are going to be focusing on causes, effect, and identification related to, you know, violence and aggression. Now, what is this in general? So when we talk about violence and aggression, we are looking at work-related violence and aggression, which could actually stem from various causes, and these causes could be, unnecessarily stress because of your role and responsibility. It could be because of power imbalances between different roles and departments or positions within the organization. It could be because of poor communication. It could be because of conflicts which could happen on the personality side, leadership side. It could be because one department might have all the budgets. As an example, working conditions might differ. So you might have all the budgets, but the other departments might not be getting the budgets because this department is favored by the management. And in such cases, work power imbalances and working conditions can cause, you know, um, this violence and aggression within the organization. And then sometimes you would also see violence and aggression can come in because of interaction with customers or client. Now, this can lead to different types of things in terms of cause and effect. So it can lead to psychological distress. It can lead to decreased productivity, morale, demotivation, and also some sort of a negative work environment, negativity in the work environment, if I put it this way. Now, identifying these are very important because it helps us in recognizing this as early signs or symbols of what is actually happening within the organization, what kind of a culture is actually developing or has developed within the organization. Things like verbal abuse, threatening behavior, physical intimidation, they could be, things which are related to violence and aggression. Now, in order to control these, we need to look at, as an employer, talk about controlling measures, and that is what we'll do in 3 slides. So we look at causes first, then we'll go into effects, and then we look at essentially controlling factors or how we can look at controlling some of these within the organization. So when we do talk about, if I put these slides on, I've looked at putting a few in, but I'm going to put some more concise slides on as we go along because I like to break this up into 3 parts. So what are the causes, that we get to see specifically, within the organization, which can cause violence and aggression? So one of them, I would put it this way, could be individual factors. That means it's individually driven. Somebody is general having an aggressive personality, their style of dealing in the organization is quite aggressive, and that would be an individual factor. So this could cause, various type of things related to individuals, and that could be things like, personality disorder, poor anger management, any sort of, mental and health issues which could be caused, and that would be individual factors. Now, we can also have what are called organizational factors, as we discussed in the previous part. But in this case, what we'll rename them as a work environment related factors. Now, why I would rename them as work environment related factors is because you can become aggressive, or you are forced to become aggressive or violent because you feel you're in a work environment wherein others are also behaving that way. It could be because you have poor working conditions. It could be because there's lack of clear policies. It could be because there is poor communication between you and the management. It could be because of power imbalances. That means you're given a role which has authority, but you do not have the power to make decisions. And in some cases, it could be because of high work pressure environments. That means you're expected to deliver. You're expected to complete the work, or there are commitments and deadlines which are set aggressively, which are required to be completed. And in such cases, these factors would essentially cause you to look at tilting towards violence and aggression. Then there could be broader areas, things like related to customer and clients. Sometimes you would generally see that customers misbehave with you or come across aggressive because they've not they would essentially feel that they've not been given the services, they've not been looked after. And in such cases, sometimes you would see the customers become quite violent and aggressive, at least verbally, on the phone or face to face. And an example of that would be, say, for example, you've given your car to service. Your car is serviced. Ended up paying up a lot of money, say 800-900 pounds, and you feel your service and the other requirements have not been met. You take the car back to the workshop, and you obviously start shouting at the person or the engineer or the mechanic who's worked on your car, and that could be a customer related or a client related factor, because here you would generally see that the client, or in this case the customer, is looking at verbal abuse, or in some cases vending off their frustration, primarily because they feel that they've not been serviced or given the proper service. Now, you could also have work design issues, which is your job, for example, is work design issues could be related to your job description, the role that you're expected to carry out. In factories, for example, if the lighting conditions are not good, if heating is not there, proper ventilation is not there, you feel that proper security measures have not been put in, they will all be related to what is called work design issues. Now, when we know that these are the factors, these are the causes which can affect or give rise to violence and aggression, what we need to understand is what could be the effect of violence and aggression at the workplace. So again, here, what we could do is divide it into three parts. We could look at dividing it into what is called psychological impact. We could look at dividing it into what is called physical impact. And we could also look at dividing it into what is called organizational impact. Now, physiological impact could be person dependent. That means it is individual factors, just like we covered, in the previous slide. We looked at three parts. Work related could be individual organizational, and we are looking at physical. So in this case also, we'll look at some sort of a similar classification. And when we do talk about for psychological impacts, there could be anxiety, depression, it could be post-traumatic disorder, PTSD as we call it, reduced morale or job satisfaction in terms of working in your role, and obviously difficulty concentrating. So these are basically kind of factors that you would generally see, which are essentially physiological impact factors. These are the impacts, psychologically, that you would get to see if conditions are not correct as far as the organization or premises are concerned. Then you look at physical impacts. Physical impacts could be injuries or assault, and in some cases, these could happen because you are, fatigued, you're overworked, and that would basically be the physical impact of, the causes which relate to workplace employment and aggression. And the last one that we want to discuss is organizational impact. Now, what is organizational impact? This could mean that if it is happening with a number of employees within the organization, you would generally see the employee morale goes down across the board in the organization. You would generally see a lot of absenteeism. That means a lot of employees would start taking days off. They would feel that demotivated. They would be, let's say, decreased productivity within the organization. And it also could mean that the organization could face higher employee turnover. A lot of employees end up leaving the organization because they are not happy with the manager, they are not happy with the physical conditions or the premises in which they are being provided, and that could be related to what is called the organizational impact. Now, how would you look at, you know, dealing with this, which is the control part of it? That is the third slide that we want to look at in terms of understanding that how do we look at dealing, so these are, I would say, first the causes. Now, when we know that these are the causes, how do we identify, that these are caused by various factors? So what we would do is identify things like verbal abuse, verbal factors, non-verbal factors, and behavioral factors that can lead to violence and aggression within the organization. So I would have classified them accordingly by putting some points down, just for ease of understanding purposes. That these are factors which can manifest violence and aggression within the organization. So you could suffer verbal abuse, you could suffer non-verbal abuse, and when we do talk about that, you could also have behavioral indicators which would show that these are the type of uh, you know reasons why people would essentially show aggression and violence within the organization. So it is important for us to understand this because we need to know why an individual shows some sort of violence, or why does the person become aggressive in a particular situation. And in such cases, this could be important for us to identify and understand and look at how do we control this so that there is no aggression and violence which happens at our workplace. Now, there is a very good article that I also want you to look at in terms of which I'll show you, that I want you to look at covering and do some additional reading for this particular criteria, which is on the Health and Safety Executive website. And this particular article, talks about how employers can protect workers from violence and aggression at work. This two-page article talks about six different points: what the law says, how do you assess the risk, what are the control measures, which is what we need to discuss. The third slide is control measures to prevent violence and aggression. How do you report them, and examples of how to prevent this violence? So when I go into control measures, it talks about things like ensuring proper training which is done, ensuring that there is proper equipment installed within the premises to monitor such instances. There is good and open communication channel between the management and the workers, and then the important bit which is related to de-escalation techniques. That means if something as an incident does happen, then how does that incident needs to be handled? How do you de-escalate that? And how do you record those incidents? Those are the bits that I would suggest that you read through. And this is a link that I've included in the presentation slides towards the end for additional reading. Now, this helps us identify and get to clearly noting that why is the what is the importance of understanding the cause, effect, and identification of work-related violence and aggression. These are the two articles that I would suggest for additional reading. One for criteria, uh, you know, um, 6.4. So I'll mention this here. So it is EC 6.4, and this one I'll mention, which is assessment criteria 6.5, directly related to them. So this brings us to the end of today's discussion with regards to Learning Outcomes 6, which helps us comprehensively cover, the outcome to understand the critical factors required to maintain health and safety in a workplace. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask, and you can also send me an email with your additional questions if you have any queries on learner work at UK Versity. And thanks for joining this session today, and I will see you in the next one. So until then, thanks, take care, and bye for now.